We are live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Socialist Unity Assembly's inaugural event, Eco-socialist Dialogs, growing the movement inside and outside of electoral politics. My name is Yvonne, and I'm going to be your chair for this evening's event. I am a founding member of both Socialist Action and, of the Socialist Action BC branch and the Socialist Unity Assembly. And I am very grateful and very excited to have been invited to help host this event today. We've got some very interesting discussion on the horizon and some esteemed panelists here for dialogue tonight. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded and indeed stolen territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, here in so-called Vancouver. Our comrades who are co-hosting this event in so-called Toronto are coming to us from the stolen territory of the Mississaugas, Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples. Apologies for any pronunciation errors on my part. If you are joining us from elsewhere on the continent, I would invite you to become familiar with the names of the Indigenous nations and peoples whose land you are occupying, and to remain cognizant of that throughout tonight's webcast and throughout your daily lives. Tonight's event is hosted by the Socialist Unity Assembly and produced by Socialist Action. Our comrades at Socialist Action have generously volunteered to handle any YouTube aspect and to coordinate the live stream. So thank you, Socialist Action. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Socialist Action is an organization of revolutionary socialists across Canada, active in the labor movement, social justice, international solidarity, feminist, and environmental campaigns. Socialist Action supports work to build the NDP Socialist Caucus, support for Indigenous people's struggles, as well as anti-war, anti-poverty, and pro-human rights movements. The Socialist Unity Assembly is a united front-style coalition of self-identifying socialist groups and individuals. It was formed in BC and has included individuals representing nearly a dozen socialist, environmentalist, and anti-capitalist movements throughout the city and the province. The Unity Assembly strives to stamp out sectarian divides that keep the left from uniting, and to work towards common goals and campaigns that will advance the socialist cause. We are open to all who self-identify as socialists. We meet once per month, the first Sunday of the month. So if you are a member of any interesting socialist identifying group in BC and you would like to be included in the upcoming socialist assemblies in March, please leave a comment in the chat or visit democraticsocialistsyvr.ca/Unity Assembly for more information and to get on our mailing list. Now, to introduce our esteemed panelists, Gary Porter, Dimitri Lascaris, and Radhika Desai. Gary Porter became a revolutionary socialist at the age of 19 and has been fighting for the cause ever since. He recently drafted the resolution for Socialist Action on eco-socialism versus fossil capitalism, which was adopted unanimously at the Socialist Action Convention and has since been published. Gary is a member of the Central Committee of Socialist Action and organizer of the BC branch. He is a writer, speaker, and educator on eco-socialism and the struggle of the working class around the globe. Dimitri Lascaris is a lawyer, journalist, activist, and former 2020 candidate for Green Party leadership. After graduating from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law in 1991, Dimitri began his legal career, in which he represented large financial institutions, including Goldman Sachs, in connection with major securities offerings. In 2012, Dimitri was named by Canadian Lawyer magazine as one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada, and in 2013, he was named by Canadian Business magazine as one of the 50 most influential persons in Canadian business. Canadian Business magazine described Dimitri as the fiercest legal advocate for shareholder rights. Dimitri's Green Party leadership campaign earned him a whopping 10,000 votes, which was 42.2% of total votes, and landed him just 2,000 votes shy of the victory. He is a fierce eco-socialist and prominent pro-Palestinian advocate. Radhika Desai is a professor at the Department of Political Studies in the University of Manitoba. She is the author of Slouching Towards Ayodhya, From Congress to Hindutva in Politics, and Intellectuals in Socialism, Social Democrats, and the Labour Party, that was in 1994, a New Statesman and Society Book of the Month, and editor of Developmental and Cultural Nationalisms, a special issue of the Third World Quarterly in 2008. She is also the author of numerous articles in Economic and Political Weekly, New Left Review, Third World Quarterly, and other journals in edited collections on parties, political economy, culture, and nationalism. She is an esteemed political theorist, a dedicated academic, and also happened to be the chair of the platform committee for Dimitri's campaign for leadership. Each panelist in this event will have 15 minutes to speak. I will be a strict timekeeper, and I will be reminding panelists when they have 1 minute left to speak. Panelists, please be cognizant of your time and ensure that you are not speaking for any longer than your 15-minute window. After each panelist has spoken, we will have a 40-minute discussion period in which Kurt Young of Socialist Action in Toronto will be reading out questions from the YouTube chat. So if you see the chat over there, you can leave your questions and comments there, and they will be read out. Kurt is our technical coordinator and co-host. So big thank you to Kurt for playing such a pivotal role in tonight's webcast. You can leave questions and commentary in the chat throughout the speakers' presentations, and we will read respectful comments and questions in order. If you have asked multiple questions, you may be skipped to give others a chance to talk as well. So, without further ado, let's hear from our panelists. Speakers will be in alphabetical order, beginning with Dimitri. So, Dimitri, when you're ready.
Thanks, Yvonne.
Unfortunately, sorry, Dimitri, we just had a bit of an issue where I got disconnected, so I'm going to actually have to ask Radica to set me as moderator again so I can take back control over the camera. So, unfortunately, Radica.
I don't know what you mean. How do I do
as moderator again so I can take back control over the camera. So, on the right-hand side of your screen, Radica.
I don't know what you mean. How do I do
this? Why are we having echo, please? On the right-hand side
of my screen, then what?
You're going to see the small images of each of us.
Yes.
And I want you to scroll over my screen,
yes,
over my image, and there's 3 dots there. On those 3 dots,
I will grant moderator. Done it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Sorry for that.
No worries.
Are we back? Hello? Are we back?
There's Dimitri.
All right.
Yes, let's continue.
Shall I go ahead?
Dimitri, looks like you are good to go.
All right, I'm going to blame this whole snafu on CSIS, but I'm joking. Anyways, I'm coming to you this evening from the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people in what is known in this country as Montreal. They are the true custodians of this land on which I'm privileged to live. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with Yvonne, Gary, and Radhika. And what I'm going to speaking about this evening are the lessons learned from the Green Party leadership contest, and compare the experience that I and my campaign team members had to another attempt in another Western jurisdiction of a radically left-wing political organization, namely Syriza, to implement a, by the standards of Greek politics, a socialist platform in Greece in 2015. So as you've heard from Yvonne, I finished second in the leadership contest. Just by way of background, the winner was announced in early October of last year. It was a long 8-9 month contest. There were 8 candidates when the voting commenced. There were more candidates prior to that time who dropped out, and I, as Yvonne indicated, finished second with 42.2% of the votes, and Annemie Paul, the ultimate winner, finished with 50.6% of the votes. Our campaign was actually ahead on the 5th ballot. But then I think what happened was that the supporters, it was a ranked ballot, the supporters of 2 of the others who had survived the initial rounds of voting, namely Courtney Howard and Glenn Murray, who I think relative to our campaign were centrists, they disproportionately voted in favor of Annemie as, you know, not their first choice. And as a result of that, Annemie pulled ahead and ended up emerging the winner. And you know, I think there are many important lessons for us to draw from what happened last year in the Green Party leadership contest. The first thing I want to stress is that our campaign was explicitly and unabashedly eco-socialist from the very beginning. And there were various times during the campaign where we heard from supporters, well-meaning supporters, well-intentioned supporters who wanted us to win, that we should shed the eco-socialist label and perhaps use more or less threatening language to people who are of a more centrist or right-leaning orientation, things like progressive. And we sometimes use that language, but we never wavered from the fact that our campaign was fundamentally an eco-socialist campaign. And the way we ultimately decided to approach it, because I think you have to be realistic about the ways in which socialism has been vilified in our capitalist economy and our neoliberal society, the way we approached it was not to lead with our eco-socialism, but rather to lead with the policies that our campaign represented and would fight for, always recognizing that these were essentially an eco-socialist set of policies. Once people understood what we meant by the term eco-socialism, it wasn't difficult to win them over at all, including a lot of people. I think many people who voted for us would not have characterized themselves at the outset as eco-socialists, but they found the policies quite appealing. And then they became very comfortable with the term eco-socialism. And ultimately, that's why I think we came so close to winning. I think most people in this campaign did not vote for me personally. And I don't believe that the people who, the many wonderful people, including Radhika Desai, who worked so hard on my campaign, did so because of some devotion to me personally. They did it because of what the campaign represented. And we came so close to winning because of what the campaign represented. And this is a very important lesson, I think, for eco-socialists to draw. And just to give you a sense from the whole experience of the Green Party leadership contest, and just to give you a sense about how radical we were by the impoverished standards of Canadian politics, on the question of taxation, we actually proposed a wealth cap, a hard limit on wealth accumulation. Our wealth cap was quite high in my view. Arguably, it should have been much lower. We set it at, for purposes of our platform, at 500 million. And our position was, if anybody gains a dollar above that limit, they should be taxed at a rate of 100% on that dollar. To my knowledge, there's never been a leadership candidate in the history of Canadian politics who was seeking the leadership of a party that had representation in Parliament that proposed a hard limit on wealth accumulation. And this was something that seemed to appeal to a great many people. Most people that I talked to about this were quite open to the concept, even people who would not have initially thought of that as something that they would support. Also on the taxation front, we argued strenuously that we should restore the top marginal tax rate to the levels we saw in the early part of the post-World War II period, where the top marginal tax rate was for many years as high as 90% or more in Canada and the United States. We chose the figure of 75%. And we argued strongly for an inheritance tax. We're the only G7 country, shockingly, that doesn't have an estate tax in this country. And people were very receptive to that. Most people didn't even know that I spoke to in the campaign that Canada is the only G7 country that doesn't have an estate tax. So those were some of the policies we put forward on the taxation front. On the military spending front, we argued that there should be an immediate 50% reduction in Canadian military spending with a view to ultimately completely demilitarizing this country, in the way that Costa Rica has been successfully demilitarized for decades. Again, this was something many people had difficulty getting their heads around initially, but when you explain to them that Canada is in fact not threatened by anything militarily that is nearly as dangerous as the climate crisis, as the potential for nuclear holocaust, as growing inequality and the erosion of democratic institutions, people became actually quite receptive to the idea that we should be reallocating massive amounts of military spending to socially productive purposes. And another example of the radical nature of our platform was we put forward a workers' rights platform, which was actually endorsed by Sid Ryan, a lifelong NDPer, who said that it was the most robust workers' rights platform that he had ever seen from any candidate for leadership, including the federal and provincial NDP. And so, for example, we had a provision in our workers' rights platform that the law should be amended to limit the spread between executive compensation and worker compensation to 10-1. Right now, there's no limit. And in some corporations, you see the highest paid executives earning hundreds of times what the workers who actually produce the goods and services upon which the corporation's profitability depends are being paid. Again, there was a tremendous amount of receptivity to this. And when workers, people who were part of organized labor or non-unionized workers heard about the platform we were putting forward, they suddenly thought, that the realm of possibility, which was much larger than they had imagined. They needed to hear a candidate actually put forward these types of policies to understand that they were politically viable. And so ultimately, we were unapologetic about our eco-socialism. And I think that was a successful strategy, as was borne out by the results, largely successful, but on the condition that we were always mindful of the necessity of explaining to people what we meant by eco-socialism and overcoming the vilification of eco-socialism in the popular discourse in this country. Now, because we did put forward what was, by the standards of Canadian politics, a radical platform, and one which constituted a very significant threat to the power and privileges of the elites in this country, not surprisingly, we faced considerable opposition from the establishment. Initially, I was not approved by a vetting committee and had to appeal that result. And although I'm not at liberty, according to the rules of the party, to disclose the reasons for which I was initially rejected, I will say this: all of the reasons related to my public advocacy. It wasn't some skeleton in the closet. If you went through, my record of advocacy on a whole range of issues, you would find all of the statements or positions that I took that formed the basis of the decision of the vetting committee to reject me. But ultimately, when I sat down and explained to an appeal committee that these were simply political positions, legitimate ones that should be evaluated by the membership and not by some unaccountable and anonymous group of persons appointed to vet candidates, I was allowed into the contest. But it was a challenge at the beginning, and for a time we thought we weren't even going to be permitted to participate. I will say that the mainstream media, again, this may not surprise many of you, was unremittingly hostile towards our campaign. Even when it became clear, based on fundraising numbers, that our campaign was in a real position to win, the media didn't treat our campaign as being a contender. And the most, I think, blatant and appalling example of the kinds of hostility we had to deal with was 2 days before the voting was completed, when I was in Ottawa, preparing to attend the leadership contest, the final day of the leadership contest. I was invited to do an interview by David Aiken of Global News. And Mr. Aiken, I agreed to be interviewed by him with some trepidation, I must say, because Global News is not a media organization that is remotely sympathetic to socialism or socialist candidates. I agreed to be interviewed by him, and he interviewed me for 30 minutes, 30 entire minutes, and I would say that 95% or more of the conversation had nothing to do with Israel or Palestine. At the very end of these 30 minutes, he asked me a question about positions I've taken with respect to Israel and Palestine in the past, and suggested to me that these were indicative of anti-Semitism on my part, a charge which I categorically reject, and I did in the interview. And ultimately, what he published was an article which only talked about that one answer, that one issue, and completely ignored 95% of the conversation that we had had, which was a broad-ranging conversation about the issues that are important to many Canadians. And of course, this is just an example. I had to deal with that kind of hostility from the corporate media consistently, as would any socialist candidate. And one way to, I think, to counteract that is to do what we did, and that is to devote yourself and make yourself readily available to people from the independent media, the not-for-profit media, which are much more objective and much more receptive to an eco-socialist method. If you're going to rely as a candidate, an eco-socialist or a socialist candidate, on the sympathies of the mainstream media, you're not likely to get very far in this country. So you have to find the platforms that are going to give you a fair hearing, and you have to be very assertive about making yourself accessible to those platforms and using them at every opportunity. We also encountered significant opposition from the party establishment. In some cases, I think not necessarily because they were hostile to our platform, but because they believed that most Canadians would be hostile to the platform. And as I pointed out repeatedly in the contest, polling data does not support the claim that socialism is unpopular amongst Canadians. In 2019, Forum Research did a poll. It's a poll I've cited repeatedly during the course of the leadership contest, which showed that a substantial majority of Canadians have a positive view of socialism. And a number that blew me away from that poll was that 74% of people who identified as Liberal Party supporters, 74%, three quarters, profess to have a positive view of socialism. Now, that was a poll that was taken before the pandemic. And I think, if anything, sympathy and receptivity amongst Canadian voters to socialist policies is likely to have increased considerably during the pandemic, when we're dealing with a crisis in which socialist policies are extremely well suited to meet the needs of the populace and to help us emerge from this crisis a better and a stronger society than we were previously. So for me, the leadership contest, as disappointed as we were to get so close and not to win, and for the members of my campaign team, this was actually an extremely encouraging experience for all of us. And I'll talk to you a little bit at the end of my presentation about where we plan to go from here, the people on my campaign team. And by the way, I just want to give a shout out to Radhika, because she was the chairperson of our platform committee and did an absolutely brilliant job. It took very much the lead and invested huge amounts of time and energy in formulating, I think, the very best platform that any leadership candidate has put forward in the history of politics in this country. The credit goes not to me for that platform, but to the platform committee that was led by Radhika. And so I'm forever grateful to them for the wonderful work that they did. So I want to talk a little bit about what happened to Syriza, because I think there are some parallels here. Syriza was a radically left party that almost won a majority for the first time in January of 2015 in Greece, at which time Greece was being ravaged by a vicious austerity program being inflicted upon the country by Greece's creditors. And its platform, although there were many radical leftists in Syriza and many radically left MPs who were elected under the Syriza banner, its platform was not particularly radical. It was, I think, best characterized as being an anti-austerity platform. And from the moment that the party won and formed a coalition with a minor party in order to command a majority in the Greek parliament, the European establishment, the IMF, the European Central Bank, the European Commission did everything possible they could to destroy Syriza, and demanded that Syriza inflict upon the population an austerity regime that was even more inhumane and caused even greater suffering than the austerity regimes that had been imposed upon the Greek people up until that point in time. 6 months after Syriza was elected in the middle of 2015, as many of you will know, the then Prime Minister of Greece, Alexis Tsipras, held a referendum to ask the Greek people, because Greece was being threatened with expulsion from the Eurozone and possibly the EU, whether or not they supported his agreeing to the austerity program being demanded by Greece's creditors. And despite the threats of the European establishment of expulsion from the Eurozone, the Greek people overwhelmingly voted to reject the austerity regime being demanded by the creditors. Tsipras, to his, I think, eternal shame, within 24 hours, betrayed the will of the Greek people and acceded to an austerity program that was even harsher than anything that had been previously imposed upon the Greek people. And I just want to cut to the chase. Last year, after several years of Greek people seeing the effects of this austerity program, Syriza was removed from power, and the New Democracy Party, which has always been at best a center-right party and now is more right-wing, I think, than it's ever been, won a majority in a landslide. And so the lesson that we must take away from this is that, and I think that this is not just the case in Greece, it's the case throughout Europe, where we've seen socially democratic parties absolutely eviscerated in Germany and France on the point of extinction. You must remain true to your principles. If you betray your eco-socialist principles, ultimately you will pay at the ballot box with a heavy defeat, and you will be completely delegitimized. Ultimately, we are in politics in order to create a humane, a sustainable, and a peaceful society. And if we can't do that, then there's no point engaging in electoral politics. We're better devoting our efforts to activism. And so to me, that's the ultimate lesson that I think we should draw, not just from the experience of the leadership contest, but radically left-wing parties throughout the Western world and elsewhere. And so to close, what we're going to do now, the members of my campaign team, is we're creating an organization. Radica is heavily involved in that. It's going to be called the Green Left Canada. It's not going to be confined to members of any particular political party, and its objective will be to promote an eco-socialist platform at all levels of government in Canada and from coast to coast. Stay tuned, and hopefully we'll be able to persuade you to become members of the organization and support its mandate. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dimitri, for those words. I'm sure there's going to be some questions in the chat about that last bit. I think there already was one. So we'll definitely talk more about that in the questions and answer period. Next up on our list of speakers is Gary. And because Dimitri did go 1 minute over, we are going to give Gary an extra minute if he so desires, and Radhika as well. So without further ado, Gary, if you would like to begin. Gary, you are muted. Sorry, Gary.
Okay. Thank you. And it was very nice to share this panel with Dimitri and Radica, who I know both of them. And that was a very interesting description of the campaign from the inside. And a lot of the points that Dimitri makes about the hostility of the press and the dishonest nature of the press and so on, I think a lot of us in the left have experienced. I'm going to step back and kind of talk about the transition of socialism to eco-socialism, because I really believe that it's very hard to be a socialist today and not be an eco-socialist. An overwhelming, almost unanimous consensus among climate scientists is that the great acceleration of climate warming began about 70 years ago, shortly after World War II, and that the principal cause is human activity. A great extinction of life forms on Earth has already commenced, and unchecked, the extinction of the human species is a growing probability. Many indicators exist to support these conclusions, from global temperature, aridity, ice levels, animal extinctions, desperate climate-related population migrations, crop failures, the size and frequency of storms, the extent of forest fires, and the ocean levels outside, often well outside historical ranges. The municipal cause of global warming is the accumulation in the Earth's atmosphere of greenhouse gases. It's not human existence in general that is the determining cause of the threat, but the mode of production and social reproduction of this existence, capitalism. Capitalism has long since completely outlived its historical progressiveness. It is now merely a rotting albatross around the necks of the human race. The poorest 3 to 4 billion people on the planet emit practically zero greenhouse gases. A tiny number, the owners of our means of production, have benefited greatly so far from ceaseless, careless, polluting production, and the massive numbers of poor have paid the cost and suffered the most. If the oil barons and their allies do not answer to the vast majority of humanity, then to what imperatives are they responding? The capitalist class must generate profit and accumulate capital. It's in the DNA of the capitalist system. The survival of the capitalist system depends, in fact, entirely upon it. But the rate of profit has a tendency to decline. So the capitalists are always searching for new markets, new technology, and speed up of harsher conditions for workers in order to reestablish the rate of profit. In the United States in 2017, 76% of all human-produced carbon dioxide emissions came from the burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, natural gas, and oil. The remainder results from the clearing of forests and agribusiness, which is 16%, as well as some industrial processes, some in particular, like the production of cement, which accounts for 8%. The fossil fuel industry is one of the most powerful branches of the world capitalist economy. They produce more than 4 billion metric tons of oil annually, and they are killing us, literally, in huge numbers. A report released just 18 days ago on February the 3rd of this year, based on extensive research by 3 British universities and Harvard University, concludes that particles called PM25 in all fossil fuels is killing between 8 and 10 million people annually, about 3 times the rate of COVID-19. What about Canada? Among 17 advanced capitalist countries, Canada ranks 3rd highest in per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And we are a well-known dirty oil producer. The whole world knows about the nature of the tar sands. An entirely different relationship of humankind to the environment is an urgent necessity. This new relationship, based on a caring model for both humans and the environment, will not be the result of individual changes in behavior. Some people just say, well, I'm going to change more towards environmental friendly behavior, and if everybody does that, we'll be okay. But we won't, because the wrong people will still be in charge. Rather, it needs a structural change in the relationships between humans. The total extinction, eradication of capitalism as a mode of production and social existence across the globe. Capitalist destruction of the environment and degradation of social life must be supplanted by rational democratic economic planning and prudent management of the exchanges of matter and energy between humanity and the rest of nature. Only in this context can economic justice be achieved between the global north and south, among peoples, genders, and all the other categories used by the capitalists to divide us and to exploit us. Green capitalism is a hoax, and the Paris Agreement does not allow us to get rid of the environmental destruction in general or of the dangers of climate change denial in particular. The alternative, it is a step forward, but it will not solve the problem. The alternate can only come from a worldwide strategy which satisfies real human needs. Human needs can truly only be determined by the democratic discussion that allows workers and their oppressed allies to take their destiny into their own hands, liberated from market alienation. This will break the impersonal logic of productivist accumulation which is in the heart of capitalism. Who in Canada offers this political perspective? First, we can say none of the major political parties. Green leaders often, and I don't mean just Green Party leaders, I mean some Green leaders, often reveal a certain elitism by advocating worker involvement in decisions, together with financial aid, retraining, and more for workers in carbon industries. But the workers will not merely be involved or consulted in the defeat of fossil capitalism. The working class, without the working class, the leaders of the green movement will accomplish little or nothing of substance. They do not have their hands on the levers of production. Revolutionary anti-capitalist change will be driven by the massive power of the working class and led by a new revolutionary leadership of the working class forged in this struggle. If that leadership isn't forged, then the rises of the working class will fall back again. A parliamentary majority cannot fundamentally uproot the profit system. Although I'm not saying electoral fight, I think electoral work is very important, but I do still assert that a parliamentary majority cannot fundamentally uproot the profit system. New laws will be overruled by bourgeois judges. Senior civil servants will sabotage a socialist parliamentary majority. The Canadian military, first covertly and then overtly, will scheme with the U.S. military. And we know the U.S. military has no problem intervening and has no belief whatsoever in self-determination. It's an illusion to think that you can overcome capitalism from inside its own institutions. Nevertheless, parliamentary work is important. It's an important way when people are turned more towards political discussion to raise the ideas and platform that constitutes eco-socialism. The reformers and social democrats believe that the socialists seek an unrealistic and unattainable goal of replacing capitalism with workers' power to achieve an egalitarian socialist society. But it is we who accept reality. It is not we, but they who propose to reform a system whose fundamental DNA is based on profit over human need, over human survival, if it comes to that. It is they who propose to keep a system of exploitation, torture, war, cruel oppression, and pollution of the earth, and try to work within it to change. We say get rid of the insanity and violence inherent in the current system by reorganizing society under democratic workers' power so that human needs can be truly addressed and met. So what are the requirements to build the alternative society to capitalism that can confront and mitigate the accelerating climate peril? And I only put down a handful here, not by any means trying to represent a full eco-socialist program. The socialization of the energy sector. This is the only way to break free of the fossil energy economy, stop nuclear energy, reduce radically the production consumption of energy. Reduce radically the production and consumption of energy, and to realize as fast as possible the transition towards renewable, decentralized, efficient energy system according to ecological and social needs. Reduction of energy use is as important as conversion to non-green, non-polluting sources. Both are necessary, and it implies much greater efficiency in the use of energy. The abolition of private ownership of natural resources. No private ownership of land, water, forests, wind, solar energy, geothermal energy, or marine resources, and intellectual knowledge. These should all be owned by society at large and under democratic control. The destruction of all stocks of arms, suppression of useless production such as weapons, and harmful products such as petrochemicals and nuclear energy. The production of use values instead of exchange values. And the destruction of standing armies with their bourgeois officer corps and capitalist uniformed and armed police forces. The abolition of all forms of inequality and discrimination based on gender, sex, ethnicity, religion, or sexual preferences. The emancipation of all the oppressed, particularly the emancipation of women and the people of color. The transition of new and truly democratic society must be fair and equitable to everyone. What we are discussing, to be plain, is the transition to a socialist society. There currently is a deep gap between this objective necessity on the one hand and the social relationship of forces and current levels of consciousness in Canadian society. The gap can only be closed by concrete struggles of the exploited and the oppressed in the defense of their living conditions and of the environment. We alone cannot create that. In fact, we cannot create it, period. It will be created by the developing crises of capitalism, forcing people out of their ordinary lives and into the streets to just simply to defend themselves. It's in that context that we can provide guidance, we can advance policies, we can advance proposals for action, and we can assist in leading. In the meantime, our job is to mobilize the leading elements, the people that are somewhat slightly more conscious than Canadians as a whole, find them, bring them into the eco-socialist movement, and begin to educate them on the true nature of the Canadian society and the Canadian state, so that there is a prepared layer when the opportunity arises. When that happens, larger layers will radicalize, and struggles of various kinds in defense of different kinds against certain kinds of oppression will converge, and people will respond to transitional demands incompatible with capitalist logic. So coming back to today, I have a proposal, and it's very interesting that it's we have two proposals on the table now, and or will have when I put this forward. One Dimitri has proposed, and this one. I propose that we set up an electronic eco-socialist network across Canada, the Indigenous lands, and Quebec. Any group that self-identifies as eco-socialist would be welcome. Each group would contribute a small amount on an annual basis, say $50 or $100 to sustain it. We obviously, as the movement rises, you need to raise a lot more than that for actions, but simply to sustain the network. I suggest the network administrators represent tech-savvy people, obviously, but also significant major viewpoints, geographical regions, and demographically representative. Through the network, we could exchange information and news about campaigns and actions. The second part of my proposal is that Using this network, we organize meetings, say monthly, with geographically rotating chairs, for example, to find initial areas of basic agreement on a few issues. On that basis, we can develop proposals for a united cross-country, coordinated mass action to fight climate change and raise the struggle to a new and higher level. Such a process, as we know in Socialist Unity Assembly, can take in BC, can take several meetings and requires patience and openness and willingness to listen to other groups outside your own, but the goal is well worth it. The network could be very effective in mobilizing rapid response to issues erupting spontaneously as well. I caution that while individual groups may singly or in alliances participate in municipal, provincial, or federal elections, we should not try to force premature agreement on endorsement of candidates or parties at the level of such a Canada-wide united front. We want people from the Green Party, the NDP, and non-electoralist backgrounds to feel free to participate. Electoral activity will be merely one aspect of our work. Mass independent struggles will be okay.
Sorry.
In
I
our,
want to wrap up. You have 20 seconds.
Yeah. So this is my proposal. But I think Socialist Unity Assembly and Socialist Action is open to any reasonable proposal based on three principles: independence from the ruling class, democracy in operation, and oriented to the mobilization of the mass of people against environmental destruction. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was a pleasure, as always. Our last speaker is Radhika. So Radhika, again, you have 16 minutes because that's how long the other two panelists had. So if you would like to begin, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. And I guess these two speakers are two hard acts to follow. So I'll do my best here. I wanted to start by saying that I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg, which is in fact located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. I just wanted to say before I start, of course, that I think that this is a very, very important event that you are organizing, and it's very clear from what Gary has said and what Dimitri has said, that the idea that there needs to be another force in politics, a new force in politics, a qualitatively different and qualitatively more radical one, has been floating around for quite a while. And I think I'm glad it's crystallizing now, because it is very critical for our time. And I also wanted to say that I benefited enormously. Much of what I have to say now also comes from the experience, a very exciting experience of Dimitri's leadership campaign. And I wanted to make a couple of small corrections, at least what I see to be small corrections, which is that I think Dimitri, of course, made a huge input into the into the platform. And I think his input really formed the floor, essentially, below which our radicalism could not sink. So I think that was very important. And I think it was also very important. The reason I agreed to work, and I found it so inspiring to work for the campaign, was that there was something personally important about Dimitri. I think there are very few people who are so personally principled, and I think that this is an important thing that we should bear in mind. Anyway, let me make my own reflections. I felt that what I should do is actually keep to some of the more general themes. So I think that I'd like to make a few introductory remarks, and then I want to describe what I take to be the present moment in which we are proposing to act, and what is it about the present moment that should influence our actions, and then reflect a little bit on what is to be done. Okay, so I think we live in a time of vastly accelerated change, both domestically and internationally. I sometimes joke that I don't know how I'm supposed to do a lot of things, because it takes almost a full-time job just keeping up with the news. Then in addition to that, one has to read, write, teach, etc., and it becomes practically impossible. I think that this accelerated change is happening in part despite the lockdown, because things were already changing very fast before the pandemic hit. And so in that sense, what we are doing, what is happening is that the changes are occurring under the accumulated momentum of the past. Secondly, there are also, of course, changed things. Many other things are changing very fast because of the lockdown, in the sense that while democratic processes are considerably subdued, shall we say, the corporations are trying to act very quickly to position themselves favorably, and this is going to add to the obstacles against which we will be up. However, at the same time, there has never been a more propitious moment for left action, or certainly not never, but certainly say for a long time, for decades, perhaps not since the end of the Second World War, because basically it's very clear that the political model of the last 40 years is broken. And the fact that the last decade particularly has been a decade of accumulating realization that it is broken, and that's partly why you saw so many different things changing in the last decade, with things like the elections of completely nefarious politicians like Donald Trump, and in fact Boris Johnson, the Brexit vote, the rise of far-right forces in so many countries. All of these were symptoms of the fact that the political model is broken. At the same time, there has also been a huge hunger for change. Dimitri already spoke about Syriza. We have ourselves seen in North America, for example, the enormous support that Bernie Sanders had gathered for over 2 elections, and 2 presidential elections. And of course, we saw the tragedy, but nevertheless, for a while, we saw that the enormous amount of enthusiasm behind figures like Jeremy Corbyn and so on. So I think there has been a hunger for change, and I would say that sharpened. You find an absolutely like a plethora of proposals for how we should change things, how we should reduce inequality, how we should start implementing industrial policy, how we should deal with structural racism, how we should reform our public health system, what we should do with our long-term care homes, etc. I mean, it's amazing, it's refreshing, and I think it reflects the realization of ordinary people that things have to change. They cannot continue in the same fashion. And even mainstream politicians are talking about building back better. So of course, they are being quite hypocritical, but it reflects the fact that they realize how much hunger for change there is. And we on the left have to really grasp this. We have to take this wave, and we have to ride this wave. It is ours, and we have to claim it. So it's very clear to people that our politics needs a root and branch reinvention. And the other very important thing we have to bear in mind is that if we do not do this, we are going to allow other far less attractive forces to take advantage of this. Donald Trump has already won one election, and Boris Johnson already won one election on the strength of working class discontent. The left is not there. It has to be there. Otherwise, this kind of thing will continue. And I would say that we will also see modern versions, modern avatars of fascism emerging. We saw, for example, what happened on January 6th. I am originally from India. I keep a close eye on what is happening there. The Modi government there is certainly connected with a fascist organization. The Bolsonaro government is also acquiring various fascistic characteristics. So I think that these things are going to happen. And so because we are in for a really rough ride, essentially, our economic model, our political model is broken. So there will be constant volatility. And unless the left is able to take this volatility and direct it in a progressive direction, other forces will direct it in a much worse direction. And this is what we have to bear in mind. So this is what I had to say as part of the introduction. Now, let's look at the present moment. I've argued ever since last March, basically since the onset of the pandemic. And in fact, I gave a similar talk, in fact, in February, well before I had any inkling that there was going to be a pandemic. We are living through a deep crisis of capitalism. It has been accelerated by the pandemic, but it has not been caused by the pandemic. In the years preceding that 2020, there were already alarm bells ringing across the world. So this is a multifaceted, deep-seated crisis of capitalism. Today's crisis is a public health crisis, of course, but it is also an economic crisis. Our economic system is not working. It is a social crisis. Our society in many ways is revealing just how unequal, divided, fragmented it is. It's a political crisis. Our political systems have broken down and our foundations are shaken. And it is also a cultural crisis. And not only are we living in this multifaceted crisis, there is also what the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas called the crisis of crisis management. Back in the 1970s, when he coined the term, he was speaking about how the crisis management of the post-war period had broken down. And so that was the context in which he was using the term. And I'm using the term today in a similar fashion, but adapted to our present condition, because what we are witnessing now is that the ability of the neoliberal system to manage crisis is also breaking down. And that's the key thing that we have to bear in mind. The neoliberals have essentially solved every crisis by increasing the power of big corporations and of the financial sector. And even this is reaching a point beyond which it perhaps cannot go. Okay. I would also like to add one other thing. Many people think that the present pandemic is a sort of public health crisis. Who could have foreseen it, etc. The fact is there are two critical ways in which it deeply implicates the economic model of the last 40 years. The first and foremost, it deeply implicates it in the sense that the pandemic was, the phenomenon of zoonotic viruses were already getting more and more frequent. We had AIDS, we had SARS, we had Zika, we had Ebola, we had all of these crises. And scientists were already warning that these things would happen. And they emerge from a systematically perverted relationship that capitalism has with nature. And that's why, in addition, I would like to add to what Gary said, that we need to have an eco-socialism, because at the end of the day, while labor, Marx used to say, labor is the father of production, but nature is the mother. That is to say, you cannot have production without all that the earth provides us. So we have to take account of the fact that we have to keep this. Okay. So, and essentially, this is also a very acute crisis because neoliberalism, which I have also argued is the only form of capitalism that can exist at the present moment, has actually run out of road. So all neoliberalism can try to do is invent a new phase. We have already had 4 decades of neoliberalism. We had sort of first plain vanilla neoliberalism of Thatcher and Reagan, state unions bad, etc., privatization. Longer just agree that markets were always good, etc. Then they said, well, they are inevitable. Then we had the era of empire, George Bush Jr., etc. And finally, in the 2010s, we had the era of austerity. Now, I think that there will be a new version, and I'll come to that in a minute. But what is the underlying problem? Why has neoliberal capitalism run out of road? Well, because neoliberalism purported to be the solution to the problem of the crisis of the 1970s, when you had the big growth slowdown of the 1970s. After much struggle during that decade, neoliberalism emerged victorious, and they said, we have the solution. We are going to essentially, not exactly roll back the state, although that's what they said, but we are going to change the kind of state intervention we have. We are going to reorient it away from labor and popular sectors and towards capital. And this is going to revive capitalism's mojo, and we are going to have a fantastic recovery, etc. Unfortunately, all the praises of free markets and competition were useless in a moment when capitalism had already become extremely monopolistic. So all the freedom that was handed to capital did not actually revive its ability to invest, to expand productively, etc., etc. It merely made capitalism more financialized. So the underlying problem of the 1970s, which was that the existing demand had been saturated this problem was never solved. In fact, it was further exacerbated because neoliberalism, by redistributing income away from labor and towards capital, made the expansion of demand even more difficult. So instead, we have had decades of financialized asset bubble powered growth. Inequality has been soaring. In addition to the demand problem, we also have a supply problem, because the only way in which these big corporations that have the support of our governments are able to organize production is by creating extremely long and stretched thin supply lines, which are not capable of being resilient. And we have seen the effects of that in the pandemic. So there are also supply problems. There is a huge employment problem. The scale in the United States, for example, people boast that, oh, the Americans have a relatively low unemployment rate even now, but few people look at the fact that this unemployment figure is based on a long-term deterioration in labor force participation rates. So around the world, we have a huge employment problem. And of course, interestingly, these 40 years have seen an further acceleration, a massive acceleration of ecological destruction, despite the fact that we have had low growth. So our capitalism is not growing, but it is destroying the planet at an accelerated rate. So that's something else to figure with. So anyway, and then on top of all these things, which were already happening before the pandemic has become a sort of prison through which all the ills of our society are reflected in full color. We see that we have suffer from inequality, racism, inadequate preparation for emergencies, inadequate public services, inadequate health services, etc., etc. All of these problems have become magnified. The political establishment is thoroughly discredited. If people feel that the election of President Biden means that somehow we can go back to normal, let me just quote you one tiny little statistic which shows you just how sick Western systems are. And I don't think that's America, I know, and we love to feel that we are much holier than America, but I don't think we're far behind. The simple statistic is that in order to win a few million more votes than Donald Trump, President Biden spent 2.5 times as much money on the election, 2.5 times as much money on the election as Donald Trump. That's what won him a few million more votes. And of course, Donald Trump is today still the winner of the second highest number of votes in a US election. So that the Republican Party is not going to be able to give him up very easily. So this political establishment is discredited. It is not satisfying the hunger for a new politics. So the opening that has been created for us is enormous. And if we, by the way, do not step through that, we face two huge problems. One is that the corporations will step in and they will create what I have called they will attempt to create what I have called a new phase of neoliberalism, which I have called pseudo-philanthropic neoliberalism, in which the model is very simple. You say that the state needs to expand its activity, there needs to be a fiscal stimulus response, state spending needs to increase. But how will the state spend? The state will spend its money on corporations. It will give corporations lucrative, profitable, practically risk-free contracts to supply allegedly necessary things that the public needs, and we are going to have to pay for that through our taxes. And this is the kind of capitalism that we are going to have. And the second danger I have already mentioned, which is the danger of far right and even fascist forces. Finally, I would like to say that if we are going to talk about the present moment, we have to understand that internationally, the neoliberal model is losing ground to China. A recent article I wrote, the title was "The Fate of Capitalism Hangs in the Balance of International Power." And we can talk about that further. I've been told I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to be very fast now. So clearly new political forces are necessary, but today the left itself is part of the discredited establishment. By that I mean the NDP, the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, etc. kind of left. They are part of the discredited political establishment. But the rest of the left is also not completely free of problems. We suffer from a number of legacy problems. We have never taken seriously we can discuss this since when, but certainly in recent times, we suffer from what I have called the penchant for network politics and Proudhonist economics. Slightly technical, but essentially it means that we do not wish to talk about planning, the necessity of planning, no matter how democratic and decentralized, but we need some kind of planning, and we never talk about the parties. We hate parties. So I think these two things have to be brought back. We are deeply confused about democracy and liberalism. Our governments claim to promote democracy, but in fact, what they're trying to do is they're promoting a liberal economy in which big corporations are free to exploit both domestic working classes and countries far away. And that kind of liberalism is not on. We are also quite blind towards imperialism. Too many on the left buy into the democracy promotion, human rights promotion discourses. Plus, we suffer from new problems. We suffer from lack of community. We suffer from a breaking of the link between the intellectual and educated classes and working people, which allows somebody like, say, Hillary Clinton, who is definitely part of the educated and credentialed classes, to call working people deplorables. And we suffer from, final point, an insufficient critique of financialization. I will end there. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. It was lovely. That was honestly very inspiring. I took some notes. So, all right. So we've got some questions. Big thank you to our panelists for taking the time to share their ideas with all of us. We're now going to enter the discussion period. So this is going to be approximately a 40-minute period. And our technical coordinator, Kurt, will be reading out some of the questions from the chat. We're going to have several rounds of questions. One round will be questions that are specifically directed to individual panelists, and the rest of the rounds will be questions that are directed to all panelists. And so without further ado, or actually, if you have not yet asked a question in the chat, please feel free. We may not be able to get to all questions in the 40-minute time period, so just a heads up that that's a possibility. But there are people who have asked multiple questions, and so your questions, if you have not asked multiple questions, will be prioritized over the people who have asked multiple questions. So just if you've got something to say, you can go ahead and say it. And without further ado, Kurt, if you would like to begin asking some questions of our esteemed guests.
All right. So, sorry, I do have quite a questions that are directed at Dimitri, including others that are not directed at anyone specifically. So, sorry about that. But our first question comes from Barry Weisletter, who asked, Dimitri, do you and your eco-socialist friends in the Green Party plan to create a new organization or party outside of the GPC? What do you think of the socialist action proposals that Eco-Socialists and the Greens and the NDP unite to build a revolutionary eco-socialist working class party now? Spencer Roshi asks, can you describe the eco-socialist perspective on first past the post voting and election reform in Canada, and possibly how to address the related problems with our current representative government? Yuri Muckraker asks, Socialist Action Canada is Dimitri considering running for parliament as a Green? And if next general election the Greens or Greens like him don't make any gains, will you challenge enemy Paul's leadership bid? CRS asks, I'd like to see Dimitri team up with the Democratic Socialists of Canada and create a new party with him as the leader. And Jean McGuckin asks, most reforms won by progressive parliamentary parties have been temporary. How do we go beyond temporary victories to replace capitalism, not just reform it? Eco-crisis means our time grows short.
Okay, those are a lot of questions. So thank you for them. They're challenging questions. I'm going to try to deal with them as briefly as I can.
Sorry, I should mention you'll have 2 to 3 minutes, so just try to truncate your answers. You don't have to answer all the questions.
Sure.
And we'll go in order from Dimitri, Gary, and Radhika answering this first round.
Right. First question relating to a potential union of the Greens and the NDP. I think this one came from Barry. I in principle favor the left uniting behind a single radical eco-socialist platform. But I don't think we're there yet. In fact, I've been supporting the One-Time Alliance for Democratic Reform, which is, as its name implies, simply trying to get the NDP and the Greens to cooperate one time in an election to maximize their seat count. And Jagmeet Singh has said categorically he's not interested. Annamie Paul has expressed reservations about it. There's a provision in the Green Party constitution which some say obliges us to run a candidate in every riding across the country. So we can't even get the current leadership of the two parties to have a discussion about a one-time limited alliance to maximize their respective seat count. But if the conditions were there for uniting the left under a radical eco-socialist platform, I would strongly support that. The left, our view, the eco-socialist view, of course, of the first past the post system is that it's profoundly anti-democratic. We strongly favor, I can't purport to speak for all eco-socialists, but I would be surprised if I ever came across an eco-socialist who thought the first past post system was democratic and one that we should continue to tolerate, which has resulted effectively in the entire post-World War II period in a political duopoly in this country where the two parties that have traded power agree on 80% or 90% of everything. Am I considering running for the parliament as a Green? I'm thinking about it. Partly it's going to depend on a health issue I have. I suffered unfortunately a bad back injury in January. And I don't know if I'm going to be up to the rigors of another contest that quickly. So it kind of depends on when it's called. But I also want to see what the direction of the current leadership of the Green Party is going to be. I think that remains an open question. There have been some promising signs. There have been some not so promising signs. And unless and until I'm convinced that the party is going to advance a platform that I can be passionate about and defend in good conscience, I'm not quite there yet, I'm going to refrain from committing to running. The suggestion that I should join forces with the DSA, well, as I said at the outset, I think we should try to unite the left entirely. All factions of the left, whether it's the DSA, the Green Party, the NDP, and when the conditions are right for that, that's what I would favor. In terms of maintaining measures, of a progressive or socialist nature that are adopted by Parliament, ensuring that they're sustainable, we can't do that without attacking the fundamental problem of inequality. When there's so much wealth concentrated in so few hands, all gains of the left will be temporary as a practical matter, because the ultra wealthy will use their wealth to corrupt the democratic institutions to their will, bend them to their will. And as we saw after, the New Deal of the 1930s, gradually over time, wealth was accumulated in the hands, more and more wealth of a few people, and they ended up, eroding to a great degree the great successes of the Depression era New Deal. And this is going to happen unless until we put an end to extreme wealth. We can't simply end poverty. We have to stop wealth accumulation, wealth concentration, so that they cannot corrupt our democratic institutions, and we can ensure the sustainability of socialist reforms.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri. Gary, would you like to answer this round of questions as well?
Yeah, am I muted? No. Okay. I think the thing on why reforms are temporary is not just inequality, but the reasons that are inequality are the same reasons that all reforms are temporary, and that is who owns the means of production. Means of production, when you combine it with labor, are the source of wealth. Labor is the source of wealth when it's applied to the resources and the technology. When all of the value that is over or exceeds the necessary product, and by that I mean simply the amount needed to sustain the working class and create another generation of workers, when all of that goes to the capitalist class, you have inequality, and you're going to have gross inequality. The only way to stop it is expropriate the means of production and put it in the hands of ordinary people. Really, it's what we're talking. What I mean by socialism is the end of capitalism, as I said in my presentation. I mean the end of the private ownership of the means of production. You have to address the state. You cannot create equality using a capitalist state. You can make inroads. If left wingers are elected, they should do everything in their power to do what they can under the current state. But they should really be tribunes of the people, and their power will not be based on their seat in Parliament. It'll be based on the mobilized masses of Canadian people demanding a change, which means that when they start defunding the army radically and so on, there'll be masses of the people will be behind them and in the streets, and the army will not be able to do anything about it. You can't, an army of 105,000 people, of which, by the way, only 38 are peacekeepers, and exists to support imperialism on a global scale. The army can't really do much about millions of people in the streets. So that would be the power that would give socialists the strength to tackle the state, tackle the private ownership of the means of production. In other words, tackle capitalism. That's the other thing is this is why I said that in my concept that a united front on a national basis of everybody who considers themselves an eco-socialist through organizations and even as individuals should not try to endorse candidates but should work on specific issues, because there will be a lot of division. I would not support any candidate of the Green Party on the basis that it has no labor connections, and it has. I agree that Dimitri's labor program was very good, but it's not based organically on labor, and it's a diversion. So I would not endorse Dimitri. A lot of people, I know quite a number of people who would not, but who would combine with Dimitri readily on all kinds of other actions.
Gary, that's your time.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I'll just be very brief. So I just wanted to say that in response to a point made in Barry's question, I think that certainly we should have a working class party, but it also depends on how we define working class. Because today, especially when so many young people are essentially today when we face such a huge crisis of employment, I think you have to understand that the working class is certainly not only the organized working class. It's basically everybody who must work for a living. Whether they are able to do so right now or not is a separate question. And secondly, I just wanted to take up the question of why are changes so temporary. And I think that Gary and Dimitri have pointed out all the huge number of things that need to change: inequality, militarism, etc. I agree with that. But the key is that you can only take on the power of capital, which we must do, if we are, and take on the power of the wealthy elites, if we have a truly mass-based movement. And one of the key difficulties right now is that the experiences and essentially the working class is divided. It's divided by gender, race, and a whole bunch of other things, skill levels, income levels, etc. And we somehow have to find a way of overcoming these divisions. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible. Thanks.
All right, that was the first round of questions. Kurt, do we have a second round of questions ready to go? And Kurt, you are muted.
Yes, we do. Just give me a moment while I prepare them. Okay, so our first question comes from Mark Lister, who says, Dimitri, do you support nationalization of key industries, banks, energy, telecommunications, etc., and worker co-ops? How do we best promote these policies? Our speaker and host, Yvonne Hanson, asks, Radica, do you see a future in which we go back to the neoliberalism of the 1970s and 80s, which by today's standards would be shockingly considered left-wing, or are we facing something entirely new no matter which way we go? M. Muffin asks, is the full Global News interview available? Alex Padilla asks, Dimitri, what advice do you have to socialists who plan on running for office, be it municipal, provincial, or federal, who have not run before? John Orritt states, right on, the working class is not just those in unions. Tim Kennelly asks, what can we do to promote working class unity in the fight against capitalism? and dinner with Franklin states, "It sounds like Dimitri and his team learned a lot during the run. I hope he runs again." That's it for questions.
Excellent. So for this round of questions, if we can go in reverse order. So if we can start with Radhika and then Gary and then Dimitri. And then for the final round, we'll do Gary and then Dimitri and then Radhika. No, Gary and then Radhika and then Dimitri.
Okay, again, I'll just say two things. So first of all, Yvonne, I think you mean the capitalism of the 70s and 80s. So I would say rather than the neoliberalism, because neoliberalism kind of begins with the Thatcher and Reagan era, so in the 1980s. Yes, I think that many people discuss this. There were many limitations to the post-war, what we call Keynesian welfare states, but they were a darn sight more progressive than what we have today. So certainly, learning the lessons of what was done then that was different. For instance, we did not have the present scale of financialization, and therefore we did not have the present scale of inequality. We had much more productive economies, etc. So those things we could learn lessons from. Although there was still a lot of racism, misogyny, etc. So we should not be taking those lessons on. So that's what I'd say to that. And Tim Kennelly asks, what can be done to promote working class unity? I think that basically what we need to do in order to promote working class unity is essentially reach out to where the struggles are and find, wherever people are struggling, whether they're Amazon workers or whether, your nurses are struggling because they don't have enough protection, or your teachers are struggling, whatever, you need to connect up these struggles and try to articulate an overall position. I think a lot of the times educated socialists think in terms of, raising the consciousness of people. I think what we have to realize is people already are conscious of their problems. They know what they're up against. They are struggling. Can you articulate their struggles into a larger, more ambitious platform? We have to go where the struggles are. And that's partly why I underline how difficult it is today that there are such a lot of such divides within the educated classes and the working classes. There's no meeting point almost. And I think this is what we are this is a structural difficulty we are going to have to overcome. We are going to have to go to where the struggles are, and relate to them, and then try and connect them up into a larger vision of structural change. Make people take those struggles and connect them with the larger issues as we see them.
All right. Is that you're complete? You have 1 minute left, but all right. And if we can go to, let's see, it was Gary next.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think the way to popularize the concept of nationalization or socialization of industry is to give really clear examples. For example, now we're being held up by the ridiculously screwed up supply lines of capitalism and the private ownership of capitalism. Pfizer tries to get tax concessions from Canada in order to give us medicine. And the again, the private property of the formulas, of the formulas for these medicines. A lot of people, I think, would agree that we need to not only make pharmacare free for people as the consumers, but that we need public ownership of the means of production and research for these things. We used to have it in the Connaught Laboratory, which helped to develop treatments for diphtheria and polio, and then the Irishman. Anyway, one of Canada's prime ministers sold it off to one of the other big companies, who promptly shut it down and just got rid of competition. So if you can begin there. You can also begin with long-term care. Should all be in public hands. I think the case for that is obvious and immediate. And 70% of COVID deaths in Canada have been in seniors' care homes, run brutally for profit and treating senior Canadians as mere chattels. So I think you make the case by using obvious situations and popularizing those and suggesting this should come back in public hands. It's easy in the long-term care homes. The death rate is so much lower in public homes. Where nobody's trying to feed baloney to the seniors so they can reap more profit and pass out huge dividends. So that's my answer on nationalization. In terms of reaching or increasing, as I said in my presentation, we don't create the capitalist crises, they do. That's what moves the working class. They respond to when they really, it's almost like when they have no choice but to go out in the streets, because they're running busy families, they have tough lives. It's not their first choice to go out in the streets and protest. But when they have to, they will. And we need to look, as Radhika said, to find where that's happening, because it happens in bits and pieces all the time. And we need to be there, and we need to show our support, and we need to talk to those people with them on picket lines about what is happening and what's the significance of it, and have they considered the bigger causes of what their predicament is. And I think the other thing we need to do is we need to reduce the sectarianism in the left. That's why I said that Unity Assembly, Socialist Unity Assembly and SA, and I'm sure the other I know for sure the other participants in the Socialist Unity Assembly, because we've all been working together, and that's the Eco-socialists of Vancouver, for example, and the Democratic Socialists of Vancouver, have let down their sectarian guard and started talking together and now beginning to work together. And we need to see a lot more of that.
Gary, that's time.
I'm finished.
All right, thank you. And on to Dimitri. If you have 3 minutes to answer these questions.
Okay. The David Aiken Global News hit piece is available online, regrettably. It's entitled "On Eve of Leadership Choice, Canada's Greens Confront Anti-Semitism in Their Ranks." You could find it by searching that title on whatever search engine you use. With respect to nationalization, absolutely, I favor democratic control of all industries that are essential to the well-being of the people. So let's take the example of banking. Retail banking services and affordable credit are absolutely essential to the financial stability and the growth of small business in our country. What we have currently is an oligopoly in the banking industry. The banks are literally sucking the blood out of Canadian workers and the Canadian middle class. The last time a bank actually lost money was probably the Ice Age in this country. I'm exaggerating, of course, but it's extraordinary how much money the big six banks make in this country, how rarely they lose money, how profitable they are. And it's ultimately ordinary Canadians who are the principal victims of this extreme and obscene profitability that we see year after year. Now, nationalizing the banking industry outright, I think, is politically unachievable at this time. But there's a middle road which could ultimately get us there. And certainly, even if we only got as far as the middle road, that would be a vast improvement. And that is to create a public option, to create a not-for-profit, democratically controlled savings bank through, for example, the offices of Canada Post, which would offer retail banking services and credit on a not-for-profit basis. This would immediately result in a huge hit to the profitability of the banking sector, because people would flock to the publicly owned savings bank that's being operated on a not-for-profit basis. Why would they do that? Because they'd be getting credit on far better terms and retail banking services on far better terms. And the big six banks would then be forced to either lose huge amounts of business or to increase the terms, improve the terms for the benefit of ordinary Canadians on which they offer their banking services, thus taking a huge hit to profitability. So I think the initial step, the banking industry and other potential moves towards public control of essential industries, is by creating a public option and showing Canadians how that benefits them, bringing these industries under democratic control. And then some advice about socialists running for office. The main lesson I took away from our campaign is be bold in declaring yourself to be a socialist. Be unashamed of it. Be proud of it. Don't hide from it, but lead with your policies. Ensure that people understand what socialism means. We have to break through, as I mentioned, the vilification of socialism by the corporate press and by the neoliberal political elites. And the way to do that is by explaining first and foremost to people, practically speaking, how a socialist agenda would improve their lives. Then they'll be comfortable with your socialism. And that's my response.
All right. Thank you very much. And I believe that was the last round of questions, unless I'm mistaken. Kurt, can you confirm?
No, we have 2 rounds of questions.
Two more rounds of questions left. And we do have, it looks like 20 more minutes. So that works out. All right. So Kurt, if you would like to ask the 3rd round of questions.
So our first question comes from Javni Carmel Moore. It's asked, the current electoral political structure in Canada is inherently removed from both the pain, suffering, raw brutality of oppression, as well as from community. Movement struggle can and must only begin with the sacred margins. How do we embody a decolonial ambitionalism, abolitionism that builds an entirely new politics that knows no borders? Nason Davidowitz states, present political parties have to change, otherwise the present status quo will continue. Agnieszka Marzalek, Dimitri asked, Dimitri, do you plan to defund the military? You plan to defund the military, but what would be the eco-socialist organization's way of utilizing the military trained staff that is currently employed by the government? John Orr asks, many members of the Green Party and the NDP consider themselves eco-socialists. If this is so, what is it about the NDP that the Greens find unacceptable? And Alison Lamb asks, Mr. Lascaris, do you consider the GPC to be too conservative now, and would you still be interested in leadership in order to lead the party into a more leftist platform?
Okay, who goes first?
Well, I think Gary hasn't gone first yet. Radica hasn't been in the middle. So it'd be Gary, Radica, and then Dimitri last.
Okay.
All right. Now you have 3 minutes, Gary.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm not going to answer for whether Dimitri would run for the party or thinks it's to the right. Because it wasn't asked to me. I think that Dimitri in the last round was very correct about running socialist campaigns and leading with program. I think that's good advice for us in the Unity Socialist Unity Assembly in Vancouver as we contemplate a municipal campaign. And I think we're very clear on what some of the most important issues are to people, because it's the one where there's already protest movements. Vancouver is the most expensive city in Canada, where the average price of a detached home is $1 million or higher, and it's quite beyond ordinary workers. As far as why the Green Party, well, again, I think it's up to Dimitri to explain why the Green Party feels it's necessary to be independent of the NDP. They're really not much different in terms of program, as far as I can see. And like, for instance, if you implement all of the Green Party program, capitalism is still firmly in existence in Canada. And so I call it a capitalist party because it's not proposing to go beyond the limits of capitalism. The same could be said for the leadership of the NDP, because that's the nature of social democracy. Social democracy operates within capitalism and only tries to reform it. The problem with the NDP and the labor movement is the bureaucracy that, well, there are practical problems. The level of consciousness in the working class is a big issue, obviously, and there's nothing, as I've said before, capitalism and its grinding contradictions are the principal source of moving the working class into action. We try to provide guidance and leadership, but the bureaucracies are standing astride the working class, holding it back, stopping young workers from getting together, not organizing unorganized workers. And I absolutely agree with Radica that the working class is everybody who works and their families, and retired workers and so on. That the working class has to be seen in a very inclusive way. So I think, I don't think there's any difference between Radhika and I on that. I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, and since most of these questions are for Dimitri, I'm also going to keep my intervention very short. Just to respond to the matter of decolonial abolitionism, we could not agree more. I have to say that on the matter of indigenous policy, I particularly urge you to take a look at Dimitri's campaign platform on indigenous policy, which is absolutely supportive of all the three main issues which are very critical for indigenous policy, which is indigenous sovereignty, indigenous land, and indigenous rights. So on all of these points, I think that one of the huge issues that we find is that most of the mainstream political parties are not sufficiently decolonial, they're sufficiently anti-imperialist, and that involves two elements. One is to look at the history of colonialism within Canada, in a settler society like Canada, and of course to look at what Canada is doing abroad, and there has to be critique of both of those sides. So that's just what I'd like to say for now, and I'd like Dimitri to use my time and his time to answer all these long questions that he's got.
Thank you, Radhika. So how would I use military personnel in a demilitarized society? Well, let me say, by the way, I hear an echo. I don't know if you can all hear an echo.
Yes.
You can. Okay. Maybe I don't know if that can be fixed, but it's gone. So in any event, I am a strong proponent of a federal jobs guarantee. So I think the federal government should ensure that decent employment offering a livable wage is available to each and every Canadian who is willing and able to work. And that would be true of military personnel who lose their positions within the military as it's defunded over time. And there are certain things that military personnel, I think, would be well qualified to do in a demilitarized country. I think we should have peacekeeping forces, although we should only deploy them in situations that have been sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council. And we should do this with great care, because there have been peacekeeping missions which were peacekeeping missions in name only and actually did more harm than good. So we would have to be very selective in deploying our peacekeepers, but I would be in favor of having a highly professional, non-violent peacekeeping force, would only use force as a last resort and for humanitarian purposes, and to the minimum extent necessary. Secondarily, we need a much more robust disaster relief, civilian disaster relief capability in this country. So we've been deploying people who've been trained to kill to go into nursing homes during the pandemic, for example. Maybe that made sense under the extraordinary circumstances we found ourselves in, but why wouldn't we have people who are full-time and trained to deal with disaster relief? And so, for example, we're talking about using the military to distribute vaccines and vaccinate people. Why do we have to have military personnel doing that? We should have a civilian force that is trained specifically towards that end. So that's a second purpose to which decommissioned military personnel could be employed. And I think we also will need, a demilitarized Coast Guard in order to ensure that our territorial waters are being used in an environmentally responsible manner. So there are a bunch of purposes to which we could gainfully employ people who are currently serving the military. But whatever we do in a demilitarized country, we would have to ensure that former military personnel, and all Canadians indeed, have access to a good paying job. And that would be the federal government's responsibility. Why did the Green Party, a lot of people in the Green Party, feel uncomfortable with the NDP? I think that there's a perception that, I'm not necessarily in agreement with this, but there is a perception that the NDP leadership is so beholden to organized labor that it's prepared to sacrifice the environment in order to satisfy the demands of unions. So the prime example of this, to my mind, was that unfortunate series of events that took place in Alberta when the NDP held a convention there, and Jerry Diaz vilified Naomi Klein and Avi Lewis and other leaders of the LEAP movement for proposing what was fundamentally a wonderful set of reforms and approach to dealing with the environmental crises we confront. I think that really alarmed a lot of people within the Green Party, seeing how somebody like Jerry Dias, who is, a very prolific and powerful union leader in this country, viciously attacked people who are widely respected in the environmental movement and who happen to be associated or affiliated with the NDP. There's a perception that provincial governments like Rachel Notley's government, John Horgan's government, support the extractive industries like the Coastal GasLink pipeline. Horgan's support for Site C has lost, has created a lot of anger in the Green Party. So these types of things, I think, have made it very difficult to have a discussion within the Green Party about cooperation between the NDP and the Green Party. And by the same token, there are Green leaders in this country who have done things which have made NDPers at the grassroots level very reluctant to deal with the Green Party in a cooperative manner. So, for example, Andrew Weaver, when he was a leader of the BC Greens, the man was unremittingly hostile towards workers, and particularly towards organized labor. And I criticized him vociferously for this. Thank God he's no longer with the Green Party. I thought that was a good thing for the BC Greens and for the Green movement nationally. But you have people like, Andrew Weaver, being essentially defending the current capitalist status quo and thinking we can deal with the climate crisis by reforming the capitalist system. It's understandable that a lot of people within the NDP are not going to feel comfortable with the Green Party. So I would like to change that, and I certainly am going to continue to try to do that. Which brings me to the last question I was asked, and that is, would I consider running again for the leadership of the Green Party? Sure, I would consider it if the opportunity arises and I'm in good health and there seems to be support for my candidacy. When and if that happens, yeah, I would certainly consider it.
Excellent. Thank you all. And we're going to move on to the final round of questions. So unfortunately, questions closed a little while ago. So there's no longer an opportunity to add questions in the chat, but Kurt and I are responsive in the chat. And so if you'd like to leave comments, you may still do that. Without further ado, Kurt, if you would like to read the final round of questions, and then we will wrap up.
Okay, so our first question comes from North American. He asked, Dimitri, are you involved in or have any critiques of Montreal's municipal politics in regards to the current admin's transportation and economic policies? Jude Goodwin asked, Radica, well, she just dropped out. Hopefully she'll be back soon, so I'll skip that question and I'll move on to, or she's back now. Okay, so Jude Godwin asked, Radica, I was reading about the Great Reset, which talks about a change from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. Can you speak on this? I've been told it's just more neoliberalism. Stanley Lee asks, what kind of synergy do you think the climate tech community could have with eco-socialists? And Rosemary Hinadiuk asks, Radhika, do you think that basic income would have the connecting properties that you say are lacking in the current conjecture?
All right, and the order of speakers will go Dimitri, Radhika, and then Gary. So Dimitri, if you'd like to begin, you have 3 minutes.
So I've been living in Montreal a little over 3 years. I spent most of my life living outside of Montreal, so I haven't engaged yet very deeply in municipal politics. I do follow municipal politics, and I would say that the current administration of Projet Montréal is certainly better than the predecessor, and they've got some good ideas, and they've taken some steps towards greening the city and making the city a more livable city. But I think they need to be far more radical. So, for example, I would be very much in favor of banning vehicular traffic, or certainly banning passenger vehicles from very significant sections of the city, and creating large segments of the urban environment in Montreal, which are pedestrian. I think that would increase the quality of life enormously, and I think we should be beefing up our public transportation system considerably, and discouraging the use of vehicular of passenger vehicles in the city limits to the maximum extent possible. I think the city has to be doing a lot more in terms of dealing with systemic racism in the police force. I believe there's rampant systemic racism in the Montreal police. I think we should acknowledge that, and we should have a very serious discussion about dramatically defunding the police in Montreal and reallocating those funds to socially productive purposes, like dealing with homelessness and substance abuse and domestic violence and alleviating poverty. But there's no serious discussion taking place in this city about defunding the police. And I think that that's lamentable and something that must change. And when you have people like Legault, the premier, denying that there is, or François Yves Blanchet denying the existence of systemic racism in Quebec, which is preposterous. I think it's very difficult to have a discussion about defunding the police, but it's one that must be had. So, the bottom line is municipal politics here need to become a lot more radical.
Excellent. Thank you, Dimitri. Radhika, if you would like, you have 3 minutes.
Radhika, you're muted.
Myself? Oh, there. Okay, thank you. All right. So I actually remember distinctly when the term stakeholder capitalism came along, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s, when people were beginning to realize just how financialized the capitalism was becoming. And part of the mechanism of financialization was shareholder value, the notion of shareholder value. And basically, what you began to see is that, for instance, CEOs, etc., got higher paid the higher the value of the shares, and they would increase the value of the shares by doing, extremely underhand things like share buybacks and so on, so that you would decrease the number of shares, so their price increases, and various other boondoggles. So the point was, it was extremely destructive, and so people said we need to move away from this financialized shareholder value capitalism, etc. So people invented, people who essentially wanted to say, well, capitalism isn't all bad. We can, just a little bit of tinkering is going to fix it, invented the notion of stakeholder capitalism. And it's interesting that in the Great Reset, which is essentially a corporate-driven agenda for transforming the world economy, which is basically what I was referring to when I talked about pseudo-philanthropic capitalism, Bill Gates' version of capitalism, perhaps soon to be Jeff Bezos' version of capitalism. So these people essentially want to claim that corporations are working in the public interest, and that they are taking into account not just the interests of shareholders, but all the stakeholders. Stakeholders being not just the shareholders, but the workers, the consumers, the wider public who is affected by the activities of the corporation, blah, blah, and so on. All very motherhood and apple pie. But we have seen over the last 40 plus years what corporate social responsibility, stakeholder capitalism, etc., they have not led to anything meaningful. On the contrary, they have taken the rights of corporations to unimaginable heights. They have taken inequality to unimaginable heights. They have merely stuffed the pockets of the tiny number of the 1% and the slightly larger, whatever it is, 5, maybe maximum 10% of the population who are doing well in the world economy, and everybody else gets shafted. So basically, I would not buy into shareholder, stakeholder capitalism at all. And by the way, if you want to read a little bit more about it, you can read about this, the whole politics of the Great Reset, how tied they are to the interests of the big corporations, which have infiltrated not only our capitalist governments, but also the United Nations in a very big way. And they have created a sort of a bridge between the Davos World Economic Forum and the United Nations. And that is the axis that these corporations would rule us in a sense. And I would say that well, number one, even if we do not oppose, they are actually not going to succeed, because the structure of capitalism on which they are relying has become so ramshackle. But that only means more trouble for us, because the structure of the economy on which we rely is ramshackle. So I think that we need to do something about this. We need to oppose this, and we should oppose this. And then in response to Rosemary's, so I hope that answers the question. In response to Rosemary's question, I would say that essentially a basic income, I certainly believe that everybody should have an income. as far as the basic income is concerned, I'm just not too convinced that that is the way to go. I think a better way to go would be a redistribution of work and its rewards. In a larger context of good planning, having planning of the economy, what we need, and a rational planning which is also sensitive to the needs of the environment, etc. So that would be, of course, the ideal. Although I would like to say that I neglected to say, and I think Dimitri said it, that obviously we have to get there in steps. So I think so long as we are going in the right direction, maybe we may take initial steps that look kind of reformist, but they are, there is no opposition between reforms and revolution. An accumulation of reform can be revolutionary. So I think we can look at it that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. And Dimitri, if you'd like to answer, please.
I think I did answer I thought I had answered the questions. Is it not Gary's turn?
My apologies. Gary, if you'd like to answer, please.
You're muted, Gary.
I agree with Radhika that a whole distribution of work and compensation for work, and a whole reduction of and elimination ultimately of the rewards for owning property is the way to go. And basic income, my views on it, you can find it on the Socialist Action YouTube channel, because I participated in a panel on basic income not long ago. Okay. First of all, back to the Indigenous question, which I forgot to answer in that round of questions. Our position is complete self-determination of Indigenous nations. That is, the sovereignty is our position. We also think that and for that reason, we supported the Wet'suwet'en and their struggle against the imposition of the pipeline by the RCMP. We think the RCMP should be removed permanently and not go on Indigenous lands for any reason whatsoever. And if help is needed in terms of peacekeeping, I'm sure the Indigenous people can work that out. There's no reconciliation without compensation. We've taken trillions of dollars from the Indigenous people. Some uneducated or racist people talk about how much we give to the Native people. Well, what we do is we give them half as much for education as we give to ourselves, for example. But we've stolen trillions of dollars, and we have to start there. So we have a position on this, and I think if you go on the socialistaction.ca website, you'll find a pamphlet on Indigenous sovereignty, which we've adopted as our position. Municipal elections, yes, I agree. The big issues here, for example, and I think this reverberates right across the country, at least in the big cities, is the complete lack of help for, first of all, making drugs illegal, and then not providing the kind of support that they need. Housing is probably number one. Unaffordable housing built for profit. We have to eliminate housing for profit. That's what we're considering here basically decommodifying housing, and that means a lot of public housing. One of the head of our committee working on this, who is a former municipal candidate, thinks we should propose 5,000 public units a year. How many units do you think are built in Vancouver? About 5,000. So basically, the public 5,000 new residential units. So what he's proposing is that we simply replace the private sector in terms of new units, and that we take over. We have the right of first refusal on anything for sale, financed by long-term low-interest bonds, and so on. So there's just a public transit. I like the idea of large pedestrian areas in the downtown, much greener. Get those private cars electric cars don't solve the problem. What we really, because you have to talk about the pollution involved in producing those cars. What are you doing with the batteries? Batteries can to some extent be recycled, but it's a public solution is, people that can't afford electric cars. Basically, if you're going to do electric cars, you should be publicly produced in any case because they're completely unaffordable. But really, instead of producing 4 million electric cars, produce 200,000 buses or other vehicles of transport. You can move as many people at much less cost and much less environmental damage.
Gary?
And finally, on eco-socialism.
That's your time.
Okay. I just wanted to...
20 more seconds? I can give you 20 more seconds.
I just wanted to remind you of the proposal I made for an eco-socialist action network to develop some areas of agreement and start up some action on a national coordinated basis.
All right. I mean, I think I can speak for all of us when I say that would be a very exciting prospect. And I would really encourage you to bring it up in the upcoming Socialist Unity Assembly meeting. All right. Well, that concludes tonight's webcast. A big thank you to our panelists. We've got Dimitri, Radhika, and Gary. So thank you guys for taking the time to educate us all on such an important topic. It was really interesting. I definitely took like a full page of notes on this. So lots to learn and lots to think about coming away. Obviously, some terms that I'm going to be looking up later. Thank you to Socialist Action Canada and especially to Kurt Young, who's been on this webcast asking questions, coordinating, helping us tackle technical difficulties, and has been dealing with like the YouTube side of things, which I have no idea about. So thank you, Kurt. Very helpful. Thank you to all of the members of the Socialist Unity Assembly for playing a role in publicizing and designing this event, especially Jude Goodwin for handling the graphics and mailing list and all of that. All the posters you saw were from Jude, so thank you to her for that. And also to the other members of the organizing committee, Tim and Ellen, who are also in the chat. Thank you guys so much for helping us with this one. I'm sure I can speak for all of us when I say that this event has been inspiring, both in message and in the number of different socialist groups and ideological leanings that were able to come together tonight to discuss viewpoints and in the spirit of kind of cross-collaboration. It's really exciting to see. I hope this will be the first of many successful endeavors put on by the Socialist Unity Assembly in partnership with Socialist Action Canada. Thank you to all of you in our audience for your questions, comments, and participation. You guys were really great. I see there's been, around 60 people this entire time, so that's awesome. And we'd love to see you again at our next event, which will hopefully be coming up soon. So thank you, everybody. Take care, comrades, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks for your excellent moderation, Yvonne. Thank you. Great job. See ya.